and Faircloth from CSU and Dr. Kathy Schultz from CU Boulder to talk with us and have a conversation about culturally responsive and sustaining school leadership today. And so might wait just one more minute if we can to see if we have a couple more joiners. And thank you, Sam. Just want to think we'll start with you, Dr. Faircloth, and I think we can tell folks this conversation, the idea really just came about a couple of weeks ago. I'd seen Dr. Faircloth tweet something to the effect of how you couldn't have culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy until you had culturally responsive and sustaining leadership. And maybe if you could just talk a couple of minutes about, what you were thinking at the time and where it came from and what you're thinking in that area.
Sounds good. Can you hear me okay, Brittany? Yep. Okay, and I just want to make sure that Dr. Schultz is still online. Her photo went away, so just want to make sure we didn't lose her.
I see her. We just had one more person apparently and bumped her down the list.
I am still here. Thank you.
I just wanted to make sure I had my partner in crime here with me today. So Brittany, if you allow me, I wanted to say just a couple of things as a way of introduction, and then I can jump into how I think this conversation started. So my name is Susan Faircloth, and I'm a professor and director of the School of Education at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. And I think it's important as we begin this conversation today to acknowledge the lands on which we're joining this conversation from. So I'm joining from Fort Collins, which is the traditional homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and Ute Mountain peoples. And it's important to always begin these conversations with acknowledging the original peoples of the lands and also acknowledging that there are indigenous peoples who continue to live here on these lands as well as in the surrounding areas from which many of you are joining us today. It's important to me also as a Native person. I'm an enrolled member of the Kahari tribe of North Carolina. And I also am the mother of an 11-year-old who is a Native child and who is Cheyenne and Arapaho. And again, we can talk more about that if questions come up later, but it's important for me to acknowledge those connections, to acknowledge the indigenous peoples. And it's especially important given that this is Native American Heritage Month. And so we always want to take advantage of those opportunities to remind us that indigenous peoples have always been here and that we persist. And so Brittany asked us to talk a little bit about how this conversation came about.
Thank you, Dr. Faircloth. If I could interrupt, I want to apologize for not introducing you better sooner. And I would just take a moment to do that if I could, please. I got so excited. I jumped right in and see these familiar folks and act like we're just sitting around my table. But I did want to share that and introduce you both real quick, if I could, please. So I do have that Dr. Susan Faircloth here is an enrolled member of the Kahari tribe of North Carolina, is a professor and director of school education at Colorado State University. And Dr. Faircloth's research interests include Indigenous education, the education of culturally and linguistically diverse students with special education needs, and the moral and ethical dimensions of school leadership. And to have this conversation with her and for us is also Dr. Kathy Schultz, who is Dean and Professor of Education at the University of Colorado Boulder School of Education. Her scholarly work has focused on the research, development, and dissemination of practices that support new and veteran teachers working with marginalized populations in high poverty areas. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for letting me back up. Apologies for not doing so sooner, and thank you for the acknowledgement.
No problem, Brittany. I always tell people, as a Native person, it's always a little bit off-putting for me to hear my bio or background read anyway. And so it's more a part of our traditions to introduce ourselves and tell a little bit about our stories and where we come from. And so no need to apologize for that. But you asked us to talk a little bit about how this conversation came about. And so Brittany knows me and Kathy knows me through our connections with the Colorado Council of Deans and directors of education. But I've also been telling people lately that although I've been a faculty member for more than 20 years and have written and done all kinds of research, the things I think I'm most known for recently are tweeting about my daughter Journey, and the escapades that I have as a mother of an 11-year-old. And then the second thing that I think I'm most known for is tweeting pictures about food. And because food has just been a real way of, and Britt says in dinners, yes, food has been a real way of sustaining me. So when we talk about culturally sustaining practices, food has been a way not only of feeding my body during the pandemic, but it's been a real way of nurturing my heart and my spirit and centering me. And it's been a really good way of reconnecting with my family. And so I've taken the opportunities to tweet a lot about the food that I cook, and I have taken great joy in just placing, it's less about the cooking, right? And it's more about placing the food on the plate, and creating these pretty photos. So if anybody likes food, I could talk to you about Ed Leadership, but we can also tweet and talk about food. Just let me know and I'll give you my Twitter handle. But a couple of weeks ago, Dr. Schultz and I had just a brief conversation online because I put out a tweet where I made a connection between culturally responsive teaching and leading. And the background, and I'll say this quickly, the background for that tweet was that as a faculty member, most of what I do is around that connection between school leadership and students with disabilities, and particularly American Indian, Alaska Native, and other Indigenous students with disabilities. And I've done work both here in the US and in New Zealand, where we've looked at the connection between culturally relevant or responsive teaching practices and leadership. And what we found is that teachers can do all that they want to do in their classrooms around being culturally responsive or engaging in culturally relevant practices. But if there's not leadership at the school level or the district level, it's really difficult for those practices to seed, right? To really get in place and then to grow and to sustain themselves if you don't have buy-in at the leadership level, at the school level, and I would argue at the district level as well. And so that tweet was really inspired by some of the work that I've been doing, but also inspired by conversations that I was having with my own daughter's school and the leadership of our district about how important it is to really be committed to ensuring that all of our students, the diversity of all of our students, is reflected in our practices, that it's valued, and that we're better able to support and honor our students' backgrounds, their heritages, their languages, their cultures, the different aspects of who they are, and that we can do that while also having a high academic press and a commitment to rigorous academics. And so I was just tweeting about that after having had conversations with my own child's school and the system. And then Dr. Schultz saw that and said, it would be great to be able to have a conversation about that. So who knows where this conversation may end up today, but I think it was inspired by that tweet and our interactions online. So I'll stop there, Brittany, and I'm sure that that Kathy has lots to say, and then we can go from there.
Thanks, Kathy. If you would just talk about what you were thinking when you responded.
So thank you for that introduction and framing, Susan. So as I think about these same issues, while I've been a school principal and thought of leadership, I don't study leadership the way that Susan does. And however, I have been really reflecting a lot on my leadership as a dean. So like many other programs, we've been working very hard to increase the diversity of the students. And we've been in our school, and we've been very successful with our graduate students. Our numbers are now over 60% in terms of the number of graduate students of color. And we have not been successful with our undergraduates who are in our teacher education programs. And so I've been thinking about a lot in terms of what, there are a lot of programs we put into place. There are a lot of recruiting strategies we put into place. But I've been thinking about my leadership and how that can shape the school as a place that will be a place that both that students want to come and faculty and staff. So again, we have also been much more successful with recruiting faculty and staff of color. Our numbers for that are getting towards 50% than our undergraduate students. And so, this conversation sort of fed into my thinking, especially during the pandemic. I have to say it's also really shaped by that, about what it means to be a compassionate leader.
Mhm.
And I understand compassion to be the act of suffering with others and an aspiration to see that suffering relieved, and that it requires that we engage in leadership with our own emotions and recognizing our own and each other's vulnerabilities. And that we really take seriously the suffering of others. And as we know, we see a lot of suffering of our teacher candidates in schools and the teachers in schools. And we also see suffering among our faculty and our staff during this time where the pandemic seems to be continuing. And I see this as a huge challenge to both to recognize this suffering and to understand how that shapes me as a leader. And I think, just without saying more, because I really want this to be a conversation, I see connected to that sort of ideas of bringing dignity, justice, and courage to my work. And so those are the ideas that I've been thinking about a lot as I think about this idea of what does it mean to prepare educators who have culturally sustaining and culturally responsive practices. And what does it mean as a leader to create the context for that kind of work?
Brittany, would you like for us just to keep talking and then we can? So when I hear Kathy say that, I was telling my faculty here at CSU that I was having a conversation with Kathy, and they were all excited about it. And so when I hear her talk about compassion and being in this struggle together, like with our students, whether they're students in K-12 or whether they're students in our educator prep programs, like I think I want to be like Kathy when I grow up, right? Because I think that is, one of the things I started out the introduction by talking about how the tweet really was motivated, and it was motivated more by what's going on in K-12 than what was going on here within our schools and colleges of education. But I think you can't talk about what's going on in K-12 without talking about what's going on in our colleges and schools of education. And I think one of the things we've really grappled with here at CSU is, what does it mean to be in a validly anti-racist institution? Not just for our educator preparation programs, but what does it mean for the institution at large? And I think it's one thing to say that you're committed to being a validly anti-racist institution. It's another thing to actually have evidence that you're an anti-racist institution. And so we've really grappled with that as a school of ed. What does that mean for us as those who are preparing future educators? And we have a really interesting, what I would describe as a laboratory here at CSU, because we have a strong professional development school model where our faculty are out in classrooms every day, co-teaching with teachers in our local school system and surrounding school systems. And we're providing mentor teachers. And what we're seeing is that, I would argue that our population of prospective or future teachers doesn't necessarily mirror what our classrooms are looking like in terms of diversity. And so we struggle with that. How do we diversify our teacher ed, our cadre of future teachers when we live in a very white area? How do we do that? How do we support those future teachers? And then if we do diversify our teacher ed population, then how do we support them once they're out in schools? And so I think that this conversation, the way that Kathy framed it and the way that I framed it, I think these two pieces are intimately connected. When I talk to my faculty about education, though, I talk to them about this moral and ethical responsibility that we have, not only to engage in the academic side of the house, but I always bring it back to my child. And I'll tell you a little bit about her and why I'm using stories. I think about the work of Linda Tahiwe Smith, who's a Maori scholar from New Zealand. And there's a quote that I use a lot. And Linda says, "The need to tell our stories remains the powerful imperative of a powerful form of resistance." And I'll paraphrase that again. What Linda Tahiwe Smith is basically saying is that our stories are a really powerful form of resistance. And so when in the telling of our stories is critically important, in resisting and fighting back and trying to change systems that have historically marginalized and served the disenfranchised, people of color, and other people from diverse groups. And so I think about that. I'm an American Indian. I'm one of 3 tenured American Indian faculty in my entire institution. I'm the only American Indian academic administrator, right, at the department head or school director level. And I'm here with the child who's the only American Indian child in her school. And so I think about, what does it mean for her teachers to educate her in a way that goes beyond just thinking about the academic side of the house? Because, and her name is Journey. We adopted her when she was a day old, and she's Cheyenne and Arapaho. And so I'm grappling with, how do I raise a Cheyenne and Arapaho child, someone who understands her culture and her background? So that's a piece of what I do as a mom, right? And it's also a piece of what I do as a scholar. But then I send her to schools where I have to send her every day trusting that her school will love her and care for her and educate her in the way that she deserves to be educated and loved and cared for. But I also send her to school every day with the fear that she will not be loved and cared for and honored in that way that she deserves to be cared for and honored. And it's not just a fear for Journey, it's a fear for other students like her, right? Who come from very diverse backgrounds, or who are the only one within her school who are like her. And this conversation and this fear becomes increasingly intensified during the month of November, when we talk about Native American Heritage Month, or when we talk about Thanksgiving. And I think about the way that Native peoples are portrayed in schools. And then I come back and I think about those images that I see on social media, or I think about the assignments that come home with her. And it makes me really interrogate the way in which we're preparing teachers, because teachers are learning these practices from somewhere. And so Kathy talks about this moral and ethical responsibility, right, to be in the struggle and to work alongside and with diverse people. And I think this is a critical example of that. Like, we need to do something better as schools and colleges of education when we see the ways in which stereotypes and misinformation about different racial and ethnic groups are being told or promoted or sustained in schools. Like, our teachers are learning how to do that from somewhere. And I think it underscores the responsibility that we have as educator prep programs, not only to diversify the future cadre of teachers, but also to really be critical about the ways in which we're preparing teachers regardless of their race or ethnicity, right? That we really have to be thinking about how we bring diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice into this work of teacher preparation, because we can read about it, but when we see our children in these schools and we see teachers and school leaders grappling, how do we not only teach the academic piece of schooling, but how do we address the social and emotional needs of our children? And how do we make sure that their cultures and languages are sustained and honored? That requires, I believe, like a really, it requires an interrogation of our practices. And in many cases, it requires a shift in practices to go beyond just inviting diverse speakers into our classes, but to be critically reflective on the readings that we assign, the exercises that we engage in, the experiences that we provide for our students. So I'll stop there. But again, I think Kathy just really touched a space deep in my heart when you talked about that moral and ethical piece, right? And that need for compassion, and then going beyond compassion to action. And how we do that as educator preparation programs, I think, is critically important.
Susan, it's hard to follow your words and your stories. So thank you so much for those. And I think those stories and the lived experiences that you share about your daughter both clarify and complicate for me. And, so it's, I think we all know now about how to change content in schools. And certainly that's one of the huge debates that's going on now with the sort of anti-CRT movement. It's really about content. But what we don't know as much about is how to change how we teach. And that's both pedagogy, setting up groups and things like that, but also how we really deeply listen and learn from our students and let that change us as teachers. And I think that we can set up this framework for teachers as listeners and learners, as leaders in our schools. So we can say that sort of theoretically or academically to people, but it's a question of how do we form a context for learning, sort of this vehicle for learning where people get to experience that. And this won't be, I hope this isn't too much of a segue, but I did some work in Aceh, Indonesia after the tsunami. And they had lost thousands of teachers. And the idea was for us to teach new teachers how to teach teachers coming in. And we realized that really the only way we could do it was to actually teach these teachers of teachers how we would teach in our classroom. So I was a literacy educator and I had them make books and tell stories aloud and really sort of have the kind of experience in their classroom that we wanted them to bring to schools. I had no idea how they taught reading, and I didn't know very much about the culture of the Achenese teachers I was working with, but I did know they were storytellers. And there's something about trying to do that as a leader of creating, we know teacher educators do this all the time, where they teach the way they're hoping the prospective teachers will teach in the classroom. And I've just been wrestling with what that means as a leader, to lead the way that I hope that teacher educators will teach, and then how that might then impact classrooms and children like Journey. So I know it's like many steps, but it's just, I think that we've gotten better at thinking about things we want to change. And, I just want to put in a quick plug for Education Deans for Justice and Equity, which is really a group that's helped us look at not only curriculum and pedagogy, but also all the different structures of a school of education through this social justice and decolonizing lens. But I think what we're talking about is really something bigger than that, and I appreciate your sort of expanding on the idea, Susan, is about what is it that we want our schools of education to stand for, and how can we go beyond the words of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion to really think about deeply what our interactions are like and how those interactions shape our ability to just always be listeners and learners.
No, and Kathy, I think about that. I know Britt's got some other questions and we wanted to open it up to the participants. But I think about the work of Brian Brayboy and Angelina Castano, and they've done a lot of work with Indigenous communities. But I think you can take their work and then with some tweaking, it can be transported to non-Indigenous environments. And so when they describe the characteristics of culturally responsive teachers, they talk about the values, the attitudes, and the ideologies that those teachers bring to their work. Those values, attitudes, and ideologies about their students and about their cultures. So I was thinking this morning about this is more focused on K-12 classrooms, but I think we can also transport some of this to the work that we do in educator preparation, right? We can begin to think about what are the values, attitudes, and ideologies that we have about the students in our educator prep programs. And what are those values, attitudes, and ideologies that they're going to carry into the classroom about their students and about their cultures. And then they also talk about temperament and tolerance, flexibility, and their overall disposition. So just really thinking critically about not just their ability to teach math or their ability to teach science, but what are those values and attitudes and dispositions? What is their why? Why is it that they're going into teaching? And then they also talk about an ethic of care. Like, I don't think anybody goes into teaching to harm students, and yet we do harm them. We harm them both, I would argue, in higher ed, and we harm them in K-12, not always intentionally, but there are things that we do that can be harmful. And then they talk about high expectations for student achievement. And I know this is a real issue in Indigenous communities, is that we have more than 200 years of educational policies that have told us as Native people that in order to be smart, in order to be successful, we have to forget about who we are as Indigenous peoples. And we see that happening with other groups in our attempts to acculturate and assimilate. So we have to be really careful about what those expectations are for achievement, but how we also then open the door for people to be able to sustain their cultures and to be fluent in their languages and to be able to be culturally. In New Zealand, they talk a lot about being culturally located people, like still maintaining that sense of who you are as an Indigenous person, or as an Asian American, or as a transgender non-binary person. They go on to talk about the need for respect, appreciation, and value for students and for communities and cultures, and being knowledgeable of our students and their cultures and their history and their language. So I think one of the things that we do well with that through our professional development school model is that we're not just teaching students how to be teachers through the use of a textbook, but we're taking them into classrooms and shadowing them and providing them that mentorship so that they really get the opportunity to delve into their knowledge of their students' culture and their histories and their languages. And then Castaño and Brayboy go on to talk about it's important that culturally responsive teachers have a knowledge of how culture and learning intersect, that they don't, those two things don't have to exist in isolation, but there are intersections. And then they talk about some of the values that emerge, or some of the characteristics that emerge out of being culturally responsive educators or leaders. And there's four things that they speak to, and it is that if you are engaging in culturally responsive and sustaining practices, that helps to foster a sense of belonging. And so when we make that connection to leadership, I would argue that culturally responsive leadership and teaching can foster a sense of belonging, not only for our students, but for us, right? As a Native person, I'm always grappling with, do I belong in the academy? Because there's nobody else that looks like me or sounds like me or has my experiences. How do I get that sense of belonging? And I think deans and associate deans can help to foster that sense of belonging for our students, for our faculty, and then ultimately for those that we're going to teach in K-12. They also talk about it fostering a sense of student empowerment, right? I would also argue that we can foster a sense of empowerment amongst our faculty if we really understand what it means to be committed to culturally responsive teaching and leadership, right, and learning, that it can foster a sense of empowerment amongst our faculty and our teachers to do better, to do differently. And then it fosters a sense of freedom, because I think sometimes we get so wedded to certain standards or requirements that we lose that sense of joy that comes with teaching and learning, and that sense of freedom and the ability to do it differently, right? And I think, Kathy, about what you said about leadership, I go home so many evenings and I think I was not a good leader today, right? Because I was following institutional rules, and sometimes I have to give myself that freedom to be able to lead authentically, which is not necessarily leading according to the way that others might lead, right? And then finally, they talk about fun, like culturally responsive teaching and leading can foster a sense of fun. And I'm all about, if you look behind me, there's a sign on my desk that says joy. And I'm all about rediscovering that sense of fun and that sense of joy in the work that we do, both as educator preparers and as teachers in K-12 and students. Like, I want my daughter to go to school and have some joy and have some fun while she learns. And I think if we follow these principles of culturally responsive teaching and leading, that we can help our students and our teachers rediscover that sense of belonging, of empowerment, of freedom and fun and joy.
There's so much to respond to, and thank you so much. That it's I mean, the first thing I'm thinking about is we're in the middle of a program review, and part of that is that we're having to write a strategic plan, which I've been avoiding for the first 5 years that I've been dean. And so we had a meeting with all of our faculty, and to get us started, we asked people to sort of think about what the goal, to think about what the goals should be. And we gave them Play-Doh to play with, to sort of create a representation. And this was a little bit tricky because some people were on Zoom and some people were in person because of the times that we're in. There's about 100 people. But and then we sort of pulled out these ideas and we're pulling them into our vision. And the first idea was to center joy in learning. So it's, it's exact, that's not what you usually see in a strategic plan. But that did come from our faculty, and it did come, and it does really resonate with what I believe in as well. I think, the principles and the ways that you talked about, that Ray Boy and Castellano's article really does sort of resonate with me. And, I think, as I sort of mentioned a couple things at the beginning, but I think another word to summarize that I've been thinking about a lot is dignity. And, and I think that really does include recognizing each person's talents and contributions. And, again, in our school as a leader, one of the things we've been having really tough conversations, and we've decided we need a set of agreements around those. And part of those agreements are thinking about how we do confer dignity upon every single person, and what we do when we need to repair those conversations and the hurts that come from them. So I think, again, I love that we're sort of going between the K-12 classroom and our teacher education programs and our entire schools of education, because I think the principles really do hold, and we can't really prepare educators unless we really think about them. But I do really believe that affirming the dignity of every person, whether they're a 6-year-old in a classroom or a teacher educator in a school of education, really believing what that means to affirm. It's about respect, but affirming dignity, I think, goes deeper, and I can feel that in how you talk, Susan, that dignity is there. The other thing I've been thinking about a lot is courage. That it takes courage to do the kind of work that you're doing, Susan, and to say the kinds of things and create space for the kinds of conversations I think we need to have, and create spaces for the kind of work that we need to do. And I often wonder where we each find that courage, and how we can continue to replenish it. I had the opportunity the other day to host the award that was newly created, called the Barbara Henry Award. And it's recognizing Barbara Henry, who was the teacher of Ruby Bridges just 61 years ago. And on the Zoom call, we had both Ruby Bridges and Barbara Henry, Barbara's now 90, almost 90 years old. And thinking about the courage that each of them, that Ruby Bridges as a 6-year-old had in walking into that school, and that Barbara Henry as a teacher, younger white teacher, so I guess she was probably in her 20s probably, had to spend a year teaching Ruby Bridges, and probably being ostracized every day for doing it. With the bolstered by the National Guards who stood outside of the school to let them both enter into the school and create a space. And one of the things they talked about is in that space they created, there was joy.
Mhm.
And that, you know, that's one of the things that Ruby Bridges said, is that Barbara Henry, even there are two people in that room, that they took the time to learn about each other, but also to have fun and create joy. And so I do think that all of these ideas are interconnected, and I do think that we all do need the courage to behave, to take actions that are ethical, stand up. And I loved what you said about, you know, sometimes we need to lead authentically and stand up to the rules that we're given, because they won't necessarily help us be the kind of leaders we want to be. And how do we teach teachers to do that as well in the climate that we're in, where there is so much scrutiny and actually censorship for what they're doing?
And Kathy, I'll say before we turn it over to Brittany, I mean, I think you raised an important point. You know, when you talked about the dignity, but you also talked about like, how do we get the courage to do this work? And then what I was reading into what you were saying is there's also an aspect or an element of care for ourselves, right? Because this is really hard work. And I also want to be really clear. I think it's one thing, it's interesting to be an ed leadership faculty member in a leadership role, right? Because oftentimes those of us who write about leadership don't necessarily make the best leaders. So what does that say about us as leaders? And I have to think about that a lot. I also think about a lot of the work that we do as academics, like how often do teachers or school leaders actually have the time to read our work, like a 20-page article. And so I think it's critically important for us in ed prep programs to think about how we translate our work into practice so that those who are actually doing the work can access that work. And so I want to make just a quick connection, though, back to how we started this conversation with the tweeting, because you talk about this care and this dignity. For me, I don't claim to do this work right every day. I think I know how to do this work, but I also work in an institution that, and I mean the institution of the academy, right? I'm not saying specific to CSU. I work in an academic institution organization that doesn't necessarily make this work easy. And so it's one thing to tell you, here's the 10 steps that you need to do to foster culturally responsive and sustaining teaching practices or leadership practices. It's another thing to actually follow those practices. I'm also an introvert, you know, by my fundamental nature is to be, I'm an introvert. And so doing this leadership work is draining. And when I think about the tweeting, like I've always protected myself and thought about how much of myself as a leader or as a person I share with my colleagues. And social media has provided an opportunity where I feel safe to do that. So I can tweet things about leadership. I can tweet pictures of my food, but that cooking has also given me an opportunity to work through a lot of these leadership dilemmas as I put my hands, and this goes back to the power of storytelling, right? When I put my hands in the dough and I'm making bread, like I'm needing all of those leadership dilemmas, right? As I make that bread, as I cut those onions, it gives me that space where I can engage in some self-care and I can also feed my family. But it's been really empowering to have that opportunity in that space. And I have a favorite bread making bowl that was passed down from my great grandmother. And when I've had a really particularly hard day, I bring out that bread bowl and I make biscuits in it, or I make some kind of bread. And I think about those lessons that my grandma taught me, and it roots and grounds me and takes me back to why I do this work, right? The joy of this work and that ethic of care that my grandma taught me. Because I think as an Indigenous person or as an Indigenous person in a leadership role, it's hard. It's hard for Native people to do it. But I think it's particularly hard when you come from a marginalized identity and you're trying to have the courage to engage in these hard conversations and to really talk about going beyond the standard way of doing things. It's draining, right? And it's tiring. And so for me, I need that way of recentering and reconnecting. I think we all need that, right? In our different ways, that way of recentering and reconnecting and reminding ourselves of why we got into this work to begin with. And so cooking has just been a real way, cooking and tweeting have been real ways of helping me find that joy and reconnecting.
I love that, Susan. And my way of doing that is hiking. I feel blessed to be living in Colorado now. I've always lived on one of the other coasts. And I'm lucky enough to live right near a mountain that I can climb almost every morning. And I fractured my knee this fall, so I couldn't do it. And I realized that for me, it was having beauty enter in my life helped sustain me across the day. So I do think it's important that each of us has a different way of doing it. I love the connection to your family and to your heritage and to your past. And the other thing I think about is I think about how hard this work is because, to be honest, I almost quit several times last year because of how hard it is. And one of the things I realize is that we need to make it collective work and not individual work. And Susan, I'm sure you can talk about that better than I can, but I think I often take on the responsibility of the work myself. I know I did in our faculty meeting yesterday, when it's really collectively as a group, we need to do this work. And that's something, I think we can continue to explore, but we should give the floor back to Britt so she can hand it over to all of you who've been very patient listening to us.
No, I love just listening, and I'm just thinking about how difficult the work is, like you called it, Kathy, and how draining the work is and exhausting, and but such important work too, and ensuring that we have culturally responsive pedagogy in our prep programs, and that we're modeling that well so that they can replicate it in K-12 schools, and juxtaposed with being able to find joy and I can't even read my own writing, sense of joy, and started with an F, pleasure, and just finding the
Freedom and fun, yeah. Fun,
and that's probably what it was, fun and joy in it, and just thinking about the leaders that we have here, Dr. Goings, she teaches principal prep program, and so teaches leaders and the leaders of different programs, and a couple of different associate deans are in comparable positions, and Mr. Ramirez also in CDE and leadership. And so just wondering what it looks like in your positions and in your work, and or just other reflections that you've had as Dr. Faircloth and Dr. Schultz have been speaking.
Brittany, I want to say, while people are getting their comments together, going back to what Kathy said though about the loneliness of the work or feeling like you have to do the work on your own. Again, just I keep connecting it back to that social media and how that served as a connector, because it is lonely work, right? Whether you're doing this work in a K-12 environment or whether you're doing it in higher ed. And I think we do this work because we have a strong sense of responsibility, right? And even when we're tired, I think it's important to be able to distinguish between being tired from doing the work and tired of doing the work, right? I think the work makes us tired because it's physically and emotionally and mentally draining. That's very different than being tired of, and I don't want to do the work anymore. And so I think spaces like this are the opportunity to connect with people like you, Brittany, or Kathy. Like, those are restorative conversations. And sometimes it's not about doing the work, it's about food. But I think it's, sometimes we need those spaces and those connections because it can be very lonely, isolating, draining work, but good work.
I think that's why burden slipped out of me. It seemed burdensome when you think about doing it alone and, connecting like this to, again, learn with and from each other and share with each other. And I love the work. And it's not a burden at all, but I appreciate the distinguishing between.
I love my child.
Work and the tired. Yes.
Yeah, I love my child, but sometimes it feels like a burden, right? To have to get homework done and baths done and cooking done. And I love her dearly, but it's hard work, right? It's hard and good and meaningful work.
Yes. So I'd love to hear more about what it means for the challenges in your own programs or your own leadership. Dr. Ramirez.
That's thank you, Brittany, for the invitation to share my thoughts. I've been reflecting on a comment that I read recently in a narrative by James Williams. And in the book, there was a quote in there by one of the slaveholder. And his quote was that the present economy of the slave system is to get all you can from the slave and give him in return as little as will barely support him in a working condition. And I've been reflecting on that, and that has provided me that ongoing impetus, if you will, because you see the impacts of slavery still in our systems at all levels. And so today I was just talking to a group of parents as part of our state advisory committee for special ed. And they were asking questions around how do we address this system for that typically marginalize our students, students with disabilities, students by race and ethnicity. And this, again, is one of those pieces around how then can we not only make inclusion meaningful, and so we shared some data around some effective inclusive practices, but inclusion is not just the place, but it's that sense of belongingness and creating that sense of belongingness for our students and moving away from that otherness. And the other piece is that making sure that our students are getting exactly what they need at the right time. And so we're starting to see some effective practices that are moving the dial for our students with regards to inclusive practices, like the multi-tiered system of supports, UDL, just all kinds of different pieces that you all know that will improve outcomes for our students. And seeing that the culturally responsive teaching involves some specific practices that address some of those things that the mindset of some to provide the least so that we can get the most out of these kids. And I think we need to reverse that thinking, provide the most so that we can get the most out of our students and make sure that they are able to, through equitable services and practices, that our students will benefit. And so I shared some data with our parents about what some of those practices are, what's happening in some of our districts, and where we're seeing some positive growth. And so that was rewarding. But again, that's my reflection.
Thank you.
I was, you definitely got me thinking. A couple of pieces, a lot about preparing principals and leaders of K-12 systems is helping individuals understand their impact and how they lead best, and helping them do that. We do some things with some individual preferences around behaviors and personality and having, we've always done those pieces. A piece that I would love, and I love how people are also always keep on saying the work. Because we did some work this summer about lighting and doing some guiding principles around equity and inclusion. And one of the first things that came out of it is saying that we were calling it the equity work, but then we were saying, no, it's just the work. If we're thinking about making sure all students have access, all kids have access to learning, then it's the work. It's always has been just the work. But with that self-awareness around some individual preferences, some things that I think we need to do a better job of is having everybody, I don't care if you're white or a person of color, reflect on their gender and their culture and ethnicity in terms of, and having some good reflections about how they will lead with that, and understanding their own biases, and helping us all understand and working together how it's going to be different for a person of color or a female leader compared to a white male, and having those understandings. And I'd like to build that in more throughout our program, because great leadership is about reflective and being reflective about everything that you do and whether or not it's working or not. I'm a former K-12 leader. I'm 32 years in, so I definitely have a lot of that piece. But that's something that really I'm going away with here. One of those pieces. So thank you.
You just make me want to do better, be more, be a better friend and ally, and do better. Be like Maya Angelou, right? Who says, do the best you can until you know how to do it better, and once you know how to do it better, do it better. You're inspirational. Thank you for sharing your message, and thanks for being part of my journey.
Britt and Kathy, if I can just say, I want to go back to what is it Dr. Going said. I think that reflective practice piece is critically important. I think it's, the journaling, like how do we help leaders or teachers create space in their day to be able to engage in that reflection, that reflective practice, right? And I know for me as a leader and as a scholar, it's always been hard for me to just stop and read, because I feel like I always need to be doing. I need to be writing this. I need to be making this. And yet I tell my doctoral students, you can't write well until you've read well. And so I think it's like, how do we support our school leaders or our faculty in taking and making that time to be reflective, whether it's journaling or I just went to a conference, University Council for Educational Administration conference last week. And I went to a session on art and making art. And so they gave us Play-Doh and they gave us watercolors and all these different things. And we all sat down and made art around how we found joy during the pandemic or what helped us sustain ourselves. And I like how Kathy talked about, using Play-Doh in a faculty meeting, but like, how can we be more purposeful in creating those opportunities and mirroring the importance of reflective practice, right? And really being able to think on what we did well or what we didn't do right. And then one of the things we've been talking about, and I use this a lot in my emails during the pandemic, is I tried to remind my faculty about the importance of patience, grace, and forgiveness, right? Like we all need to not just practicing patience and grace and forgiveness with each other, but we need to practice patience, grace, and forgiveness with ourselves, right? That that we're all learning and we don't have it all right and we're going to make mistakes and we can do it all again tomorrow. And it was just really important for me because I think I'm oftentimes forgiving of my faculty and gracious with my faculty. Patience I struggle with, but the forgiveness and grace, I think I got that down with my faculty, but I don't necessarily practice that well with myself, right? And so I think just reminding our leaders and our teachers that it is important to give yourself that same grace and patience and forgiveness that you give others. And how do we incorporate that into educator prep programs or school leadership programs? Because I think it's really important. Kathy may be really great at forgiving her, so there's nothing you have to forgive yourself about, right? Or being really gracious. I just know I'm not always good.
Oh, I'm terrible at it. I think that's the thing I have to learn the most. Is to be patient with myself, Grace. Yeah, I think I during the pandemic, I wrote to my faculty at first every day and then once a week, and now it's once every other week. And those are exactly the messages I sent to them, and I'm very hard at applying it to myself. I also send everybody poetry just for that same reason, because I think we all need to just have that time to write. And I think poetry helps with that.
Like that. Britt, we needed a part 2. We needed like a podcast. We can.
I think so too. I can't wait. We do need to keep these conversations going. I don't want this week to be over. It's certainly not the end of this important work. And so I don't want it to be the end of the conversations. So we're actively trying to find ways that we can, keep the conversations going, be able to learn from each other. And Dr. William Anderson from DU just talked about sharpening iron with iron. And that's the way that we make all the programs stronger together and support each other, that we don't have to do it alone. So I'm so thankful for you and your leadership, Dr. Faircloth and Dr. Schultz, and all of you for attending.
Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you all for being here.